Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to this CASLPO e-forum on the Guide for Equitable and Inclusive Services. Thank you for taking the time to join us today. We will begin with a land acknowledgement. As this e-forum is virtual and we are not all gathered in the same space, we recognize that this acknowledgement may not represent the lands upon which you are now. If this is the case and you have not already done so, we invite you to take a moment to acknowledge the traditional territory you are currently on. At the College of Audiologists and Speech Language Pathologists of Ontario, we acknowledge the traditional territory of many nations, including the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples. I personally am currently situated in the traditional territory of the Oneida Indian Nation and the Haudenosaunee Iroquois territory. This land continues to be a cultural and economic anchor for the region. Through diversified business enterprises, the communities in this region have forged agreements with neighboring governments that have fortified the nation's sovereignty in perpetuity. Acknowledging the history of this land reminds us that our great standard of living is directly related to the resources, sacrifices, and friendship of Indigenous people.
I acknowledge that the land I am presenting on is from Tikaronto, which is covered by Treaty 13 with the Mississaugas of the Credit. As a part of our acknowledgement, we recognize our own need for further understanding and personal education. We make the commitment to recognize and honor the patients, the colleagues, and the people we interact with who are members of Indigenous communities.
A personal goal of mine is to complete the Indigenous Relationship and Cultural Awareness courses offered by Cancer Care Ontario. These free online courses provide health professionals with knowledge about the history and culture of First Nations, Inuit, Métis, and urban Indigenous people and communities, with the goal of supporting culturally appropriate patient-centered care. On the slide, we've provided a link to the Cancer Care Ontario course, as well as a link to a website that you can use to learn more about the traditional territory that you are situated on. So again, we'd just like to take a moment to welcome everyone who is joining us today. We have several hundred participants, so thank you very much. Just some reminders as we get started. Close other running applications to help improve your connection to the session. If you experience any technical issues, try exiting and returning into the session. The recording and slides for this presentation will be published on CASLPO's website under Events and e-Forums. And viewing of this session can be counted towards your self-assessment tool learning goals. If you have any questions as you're watching today, you can type those questions in the box that will be available on your screen. We have staff who are monitoring the questions, and we will take a couple of breaks for questions. We do anticipate many questions today, but given the length of the presentation and the content that we would like to get through, we may not be able to get to every question. But please rest assured that we are receiving your questions. We value your input, and we will respond individually. My name is Samita Joglekar, and I'm the Audiology Advisor and Manager of Mentorship at the College.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Priya Singh. I'm the Director of Professional Conduct, General Counsel, and Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Officer at the College. Today, we're going to be looking at, as Samita indicated, a variety of topics. These will include an overview of the demographic data that CASLPO collected last year, as well as how that is relevant to the guide. We're also going to look at new information that's been contained in the Guide for Equitable and Inclusive Services, and we're going to walk you through 4 scenarios. It's important to remember that these scenarios are entirely fictitious, and they are made for educational purposes only. Now, looking at the demographic data, at a very high level, during the 2022-2023 annual renewal period, registrants were asked to volunteer information and answer questions about the demographic data that reflects them. we had a 67% response rate. And as you can see from the slide, we've discovered a number of different variables and identities that our registrants have. They have over 40 ethnicities that they identify with, possess a number of abilities, and also practice in a variety of settings. What's important to take away from the data is that we were also able to identify trends or homogeneous groups amongst our registrant base from those who had responded to the survey. As you can see from the slide, over 96% of respondents indicated that English is their spoken language. From that, we also identified that the majority of respondents were female, heterosexual, and able-bodied, with percentages of 91, 90, and 89% respectively. The next largest group of respondents identified as white, 74%, and 64% reported that they lived or practiced in an urban environment. Now, this information is interesting when you compare it to the information or the data that reflects Ontario. So for example, racial and ethnic identity from census data collected around 2020 indicated that over 9 million Ontarians did not identify with a racial or ethnic identity. However, when you look at the next three categories, over 2 million people identified with a racial or ethnic identity that was South Asian, Chinese, or Black. So how this relates to the guide is it highlights the importance. Let's the next slide. Thank you. It highlights the importance that when we are faced with individuals or communities that do not match ourselves, it can be challenging to understand and provide intervention. We may not know how to respond to the different beliefs or convictions our patients may have, especially when they're different from our own. And finding those answers to provide appropriate intervention and support may not always be simple. So the challenges that you may face in practice based on the data that we know may be inevitable ultimately, but practicing with humility and openness are keys to making progress in providing inclusive and equitable services. With that, I will turn it to Samita to discuss further why the guide is important.
Thanks so much, Priya. So let's continue our discussion of why this is such an important document. The Guide for Equitable and Inclusive Services encourages us as audiologists and speech-language pathologists, as health professionals, to reflect on our own bias, to explore blind spots, and to challenge our assumptions. And the guide encourages us to lean into the discomfort of doing this. So it doesn't feel very comfortable sometimes to explore the things that we don't know, to explore our own bias, but the guide is encouraging us to be willing to engage in this challenging internal dialogue with ourselves and also to engage in what might be challenging conversations that we need to have. The guide is also encouraging us to seek to understand and listen to the voices that we normally don't hear. And I would just like to take this opportunity to point out that the guide is attached today as a resource in both English and French, and you should see that available on your screen. The guide asks for our commitment as health professionals as well to examine our own personal values, beliefs, and privileges to understand how this impacts on the care that we provide to patients. So our personal values, beliefs, and privileges are a result of many factors, including our upbringing, where we've lived, our access to education, our family, our social and employment relationships, our friend circle, any affiliations we may have with different groups and communities. And all of these things come together to shape our life experience. These things also are part of the reason why we may develop bias, perhaps in favor of or against certain ideas or ways of thinking, or perhaps certain groups. But the guide is asking for our commitment in this regard to actively engage then in continuous learning in this area, to develop our knowledge, our self-awareness, and our skill and judgment. So to think about how can we adapt our services? How can we better meet the needs of the unique individuals who are our patients? And this is a journey of learning that is different for each of us, but it requires all of our active participation. And these ideas directly link with an important principle in the guide, which is principle number 2, to practice with cultural competence and cultural humility. So through this commitment that the guide is asking from us, the result that we strive for is equitable and inclusive services that recognize the uniqueness of each individual, and the ability to adapt and adjust services and care based on the various dimensions of a patient's identity and how these dimensions intersect to create unique needs. So there are many dimensions of a person's identity. Some are visible, some are invisible. And here on this slide, in this diagram, we're looking at 4 of the many potential dimensions that make up a person. What we are trying to convey with this diagram is that many of these dimensions exist on a continuum. So if we look at sex assigned at birth, on either side of the arrow, we have what society expects. So society tends to expect that the sex assigned at birth will be either female or male. But in reality, there is a whole continuum of possibility in terms of a person's experience or how a sex may be assigned. With gender identity, the expectation is that a person will identify as either a woman or a man often. But there is a whole continuum of experience that is possible for a person to identify in terms of their gender. For gender expression, the expectation is often that it will be feminine or masculine, but again, there is a whole realm of possibility there in terms of expression, a whole continuum. And the same with sexual orientation. So what we're trying to get across here is that this is to demonstrate that often our expectations or what we think about others is not in tune with the reality of that person's experience. And it really drives home the point that we must respect a person's sense of self, and we have to listen and allow people to tell us what their experience is, what their story is, how they experience the world. So if we were to layer on top of this other dimensions, like for example, race. So if you layer on the dimension of race and try to imagine how a person with different racial identity would experience health care, if they're also trying to navigate these aspects of their identity that we have here on the slide. Or if you layer on top of that religion or age, or a person experiencing a disability, or education, how would a person who has had access to education and who is navigating these aspects of their identity, how would they experience healthcare versus someone who has not had access to education? So in this way, we can see how the different dimensions of identity intersect and influence each other and create a unique experience for each individual. And these are important ideas to consider as health professionals in relation to the services and care that we provide. As Priya mentioned, we know that the population of Ontario is continuing to increase in its diversity. And so it is important for us to reflect on these ideas in the guide and to think about how can we adapt our care? How can we provide patient-centered care that will be equitable and inclusive? We also wanted to talk about how this guide is different from other CASLPO documents. So the guide for equitable and inclusive services, it's written expecting that we are, as audiologists and SLPs, speech language pathologists, following applicable laws, the code of ethics, and regulations and standards that apply to our practice. The guide is providing principles and we're going to reflect on those principles, and informational guidance to help us reflect upon and apply these concepts in our practice. And the guide relies on our professional judgment to do this. So we are all practicing in different environments across Ontario with different patient populations. And so these principles rely on our professional judgment and this commitment, as we're discussing, to build our cultural humility and competence. So I will pass it back to Priya now for the next section.
Thank you very much, Smita. This portion of our e-forum today is going to look at a high level at the changes that we made to the guide that we've been discussing. So the first item that we wanted to highlight is the title. The previous guide was entitled The Guide for Service Delivery Across Diverse Cultures. And so as many of you are likely aware, the current guide is a revised version of the previous document. The previous document was entitled With Culture, which is defined loosely as involving customs, beliefs, behaviors, or achievements at a particular time with respect to a particular group of people. Now, that definition is quite narrow when you consider the various dimensions of an individual's identity. But it was appropriate at the time because our language in this topic has been evolving. And so to bring the guide to our current standards, the intention was the title should direct individuals to provide inclusive care or to receive inclusive care, and that we need to acknowledge the various dimensions of each patient. Therefore, the guide title was revised to Guide for Equitable and Inclusive Services. The guide now also contains solidified principles in which we expect registrants to provide equitable and diverse care. The first principle, many of you may already be familiar with because it was taken from the previous version, and it is the requirement to recognize every individual as unique. It means that every individual can be like no other, can be like some others, or can be like all others. It's a reflection of the fact that while there may be similarities between individuals, like for example, Sumita and myself, we may appear as though we come from the same cultural or ethnic background, but we may be vastly different in the type of experiences, education, and our own personal histories, and that ultimately makes us different people. The second principle requires that we practice with cultural competence and cultural humility. The third principle asks that we address and recognize conscious and unconscious bias. And the fourth principle is the requirement to engage in anti-racist and anti-discriminatory practice. Now, as I indicated, the previous guide discussed these concepts in varying degrees, either directly as Principle 1 was, or generally as Principle 4 was in the previous document. These revisions were an attempt on our part to solidify the context, to provide greater clarity for our registrants in their practice. There's also a new section on pronouns, and it discusses the importance of respecting and recognizing a patient's identity through the use of pronouns. It also provides various examples and direct community links to further resources on the topic. We've expanded and updated the definition list to include items like diversity, equity, and intersectionality. And we've also expanded and updated the resource list. While the guide is meant to be a comprehensive document in terms of providing equitable and inclusive care, we also recognize that we cannot provide guidance on every topic for every group and for every community. And so what we've tried to do is provide resources that will direct you for additional learning and continued education. Now we're going to take a moment for questions. And I know they're being monitored in the background.
Hi there, I have some questions. All right, so the first question that I have is, at my school board, admin is talking about how gender is a social construct and that this fad will pass. Do we have to make these changes forever?
I can take that one, Sumita. So I would say that potentially the individual who made that comment needs to do some learning on their part. gender is to a certain extent a social construct, but it also is a reflection of who we are. We have the right to identify who we are. And it's not a fad to say that we recognize everybody for being the unique individual that they are. And that perhaps in 10 years, we'll go back to slotting everyone into pre-existing categories that essentially makes it easy for us to understand. So I would suggest that potentially there is room for more learning, but also that there needs to be an expansion in the understanding of how we respect each other. Smee, do you have anything to add?
I completely agree, and would just add that I think it's important to recognize that things are changing very rapidly in this area. You know, things that were perhaps acceptable even just 2 or 3 years ago, we have new terminology. We learn a lot every year, every month, every day. So, and I think we have to listen to the people that we work with, the patients, what they need from us, what their preferences are or what their needs are, and respond to that as well.
Thank you, Samita, and thank you, Priya. Another question we have is, where can we learn more about diversity, equity, and inclusion?
I can start off with that one, Priya. So I think there's lots of, there are many educational opportunities available out there. In the guide, as Priya mentioned, there's lots of very helpful links. So you can start with the guide and look at the links that are provided. We have a diversity, equity, and inclusion webpage also on the CASLPO website that will link you to lots of different resources. Look in your community, and these are good starting points. Priya, would you add anything?
Nope, I think that was perfect.
Thank you. And the last question is, what about respecting the religious views of colleagues or college members, registrants?
Is there a way to unpack that a little bit?
I think what the person is asking is, so regarding like, how can we do more to respect the religious beliefs that our colleagues and college registrants may have?
I can,
yeah.
I can start off with some thoughts around that. I mean, I think having a conversation with that person to begin with, you know, having an open conversation with them and asking them what they need, you know, what do they need to feel like they are being acknowledged and recognized for, you know, the background that they belong to, and are there particular ways that the workplace or colleagues could respond to make that person feel more supported in that way. So I think a conversation is always a great way to start. Priya?
I agree. I think that that's a fantastic way to engage. I think also considering community sources, potentially if it is a religious group, reaching out to those organizations and, you know, in a respectful way, identify that you're looking for more knowledge. You're looking to understand perhaps restrictions or dietary implications, and doing some self-learning from some community experts, if you will, because it's important, I think, to also recognize that if we are asking, say, a colleague or a patient about their experience, about their needs, we don't want to put them in a position where they have to explain everything, that we make them now responsible for providing the healthcare provider with all the information they need to provide that intervention. And so I think there's a multitude of avenues that we can use to improve our communications and our respect for each other.
Thank you both. I think we have time for one more question, and the one that I have here for you is, if you do not know how somebody identifies, is it appropriate to ask that person?
Absolutely. I think in a respectful way. We've heard examples where an individual may ask, how do I refer to you in patient record or in your reports? I want to make sure that I'm accurately identifying who you are. And, you know, I think going back to some of our principles, approaching that conversation with humility and not purporting as though you know the answer in advance, but engaging in a way where you want to learn and explore and understand the patient in front of you.
I agree. I think asking is the best way to go about it, and asking the person is very important. Reflecting on, we talked about assumptions and how making assumptions can be can lead us astray very quickly. So asking the person is a great idea.
Thank you so much.
Okay, I think we're going to continue. Okay.
Perfect. So I'm going to walk you through the first scenario, but before we enter those conversations, we want to take the opportunity to flag that some of the content, some of the scenarios or the topics that we're discussing may evoke strong emotions. It may be triggering. It may bring up experiences for yourself. So we want to emphasize that we hope that you are in a safe place, and that if you need to take a step back from the discussion today, remember that the session will be recorded and available on the college's website, the slide deck as well. And so if you have any questions and are unable or feeling unwilling to continue with today's session, know that staff are always happy to answer any follow-up questions that you may have. So with that, I'm going to turn to scenario 1, which is considering the use of personal pronouns. Now, Diego is a parent who advises Sam, an audiologist, that his child, whose birth name was Jack, identifies as she, her, and is called Jackie. Throughout Jackie's hearing assessment, Sam refers to Jackie as he or him. Diego's noted through Jackie's hearing assessment report that Jackie is referred to as he, him. Diego talks to Sam and asks that the report be amended to reflect Jackie's pronoun. However, Sam refuses to amend the report, and he writes to Diego, Jack's preferred pronouns are not relevant to the hearing assessment report. I am not aware of other healthcare professionals being asked to change pronouns in the reporting, and so I will not do so either. So your first polling question today will be, did Sam take the right approach in continuing to refer to Jackie as he, him? Your options are yes, no, or not sure. Just going to give you a few moments to vote. Okay, and the overwhelming majority of you have indicated no, Jack or Sam did not take the right approach. Okay. I think you have to click. Thank you. So as a regulated healthcare professional, Sam has a responsibility to adopt an equitable and inclusive approach when providing services. Now, recalling back to Principle 1 from the guide requires Sam to recognize that every individual is unique, and that this requires respecting and recognizing the patient's identity by using pronouns they use to reflect their own gender identity. Pronouns are central to respectful interactions. By using the right pronoun, Sam would affirm the patient's identity and challenge discriminatory practices. This is another way of engaging in anti-discriminatory practice, for example. By using the wrong pronoun, Sam can make his patient feel excluded, frustrated, uncomfortable, or unheard. It's also important to note that misgendering is also a form of discrimination that has been recognized in our court system. So what could Sam have done in the circumstances? Sam should have referred to Jackie as she, her. It is who Jackie is. Sam should not have used the phrase prefer pronouns in his communication with Diego. And this is principally because preferred pronoun connotes that gender identity is optional, that it's a choice, but pronouns are not a preference. They simply are reflecting of who we are. So if it was relevant to Sam and the assessment report, he could have noted that Jackie was assigned male at birth, but in the rest of the record identified Jackie's pronouns of she, her. With that, I turn it to Samita to walk you through scenario 2.
Thank you, Priya. So let's have a look at the next scenario. And this one is around conscious and unconscious bias. So Martin, who could be a speech language pathologist or an audiologist, identifies as a heterosexual white Christian male. He is preparing to meet a grade 9 student, Kofi, for the first time for an assessment. Kofi is a new student on Martin's caseload. So in reviewing the background information, Martin learns the following details. Kofi's pronouns are they, them, and Kofi previously received SLP intervention for literacy skills. So Martin sees Kofi through a window, and he notes Kofi's skin color is dark, he is wearing a hoodie, and has eyebrow piercings. Based on these observations about Kofi's appearance, Martin finds himself jumping to the following assumptions. Kofi may be a low achiever. Kofi may not speak English well, or Kofi may be from a lower socioeconomic background and may not have a stable home. So we are going to launch a polling question. And the question is, Martin's assumptions about Kofi are an example of choose any that you feel apply. Is this conscious bias? Is this discrimination, including systemic racism? Is this unconscious bias? Or is this Martin's position of privilege? Okay, we'll just allow a few more moments for everyone to participate. All right, and we can see from participation that all of the different choices have been selected. Close to 80% are feeling that this is discrimination, including systemic racism and also unconscious bias, but many have also selected the other conscious bias and privilege. So let's discuss the answer that we also came up with, the answer that this is likely a combination of all of these different factors. We are highlighting this as an example of conscious or unconscious bias. And if we look to the guide, we have definitions. So unconscious bias refers to the assumptions, beliefs, attitudes, and stereotypes that people have about different groups that we are not aware of. So we have this feeling, but we can't always explain it. We're not sure where the feeling is coming from. Whereas conscious bias involves our awareness and the ability to identify that we have a bias and where it may come from. So in Martin's case, whether this is conscious or unconscious bias on his part would depend on how aware Martin is of where these assumptions are coming from, and if he's able to explain or identify the source of these learned assumptions, and if he's aware of how these assumptions could impact on his behavior, actions, and decisions. So let's continue with this scenario. Martin learns from colleagues who have interacted with Kofi that they are top of their class, an all-around leader amongst their peers, and very ambitious. And then he learns about Kofi's perspective. And Kofi's perspective is that they never had trouble with literacy, but were placed in special classes due to their racial identity. So Kofi may have been referred for SLP intervention in the past due to previous assumptions about their literacy skills based on race or ethnicity. And this would tie back to Martin's initial assumptions that he was making as well. So from all of this, Martin realizes his assumptions are inaccurate, that his assumptions could adversely affect how he interacts with individuals, and that this may interfere with his decision-making and professional relationships with patients. And this is a reflection question for all of us to think about. How could Martin's assumptions have impacted his approach to providing intervention for Kofi? So without considering Kofi's perspective, without listening to Kofi and understanding Kofi's experiences so far, Martin may have decided on a plan of intervention that wouldn't be effective or patient-centered, that wouldn't be based on Kofi's actual needs, goals, or desires. So what can Martin do to address unconscious or conscious beliefs or bias? And here is where we can turn to the guide. So principle number 1, again, is always very important, recognizing that every individual is unique. Principle number 3 talks about addressing and recognizing conscious and unconscious bias. And some suggestions are to avoid making assumptions based solely on the perceived culture or individual appearance. So this goes back to a lot of what we've been talking about, that just based on how we perceive a person or what a person looks like to us, we may automatically make assumptions, but the truth is their experience could be very different. So we should invite patients to share their perspective with us and listen to them, really listen to them with an open mind and identify what is important. And then respond to the diverse perspectives each individual brings to the clinical relationship. And I'll pass it back to Priya now for our third scenario.
Great, thank you very much, Smita. In this scenario, we'll be looking at cultural competence and cultural humility. So Jan, an SLP, has conducted an assessment on 12-year-old Yura, who is of Indigenous status. Now, Jan uses standardized testing to conduct the assessment, and the assessment report concluded that Yura has a language impairment. Now, Mary, Yura's mother, felt that Jan ignored Yura's Indigenous status and failed to consider cultural influences when conducting the assessment. Mary shared educational material with Jan to assist with her understanding Yura's status and asked her to update or redo the test. Jan responded by stating that she applied the correct testing protocols when she conducted the assessment. The standardized tests are blind to cultural dispositions, and it would be improper for her to substitute other tests to meet specific needs of the patient, and her report recommendations catered for improving Yura's ability to communicate. Therefore, Jan refused to conduct another assessment on Yura. So your polling question: did Jan provide patient or person-centered care that recognizes and respects diversity and is also equitable and inclusive? Your options are yes, no, or not sure. Give you a few more moments. Wonderful. So the overwhelming majority of you have indicated that Jan did not provide patient-centered care. So we're going to unpack that a little bit. First and foremost, remember the Code of Ethics, which under Principle 2 requires that all audiologists and speech-language pathologists practice towards their patient benefit. So it is a requirement to protect and act in the best interest of your patients using the knowledge, skill, and judgment to provide quality, competent care. It is a requirement to treat all patients justly and fairly. The Code of Ethics goes on to indicate that all registrants of the college must not discriminate against anyone and makes direct reference to the Ontario Human Rights Code. Audiologists and speech-language pathologists are also required to provide patient-centered care that recognizes and respects diversity and is equitable and inclusive, and also to collaborate and communicate effectively with all of those involved. So how does this apply for Jan? Jan could have noted that standardized assessments and treatment protocols may be based on norms that are not reflective of Yura, her patient. Jan could have considered the dimensions of diversity and intersectionality as they impact her patient. How is Yura's own experiences going to impact the intervention and the relationship they have with Jan? And could non-standardized intervention protocols be useful in this circumstance? Because it may be crucial in achieving intervention that is appropriate and equitable for Yura. Further guidance for Jan can include the requirement to collaborate with the patient to plan out how their identity may affect their language needs and to address that through intervention. Addressing that is through developing assessment and intervention protocols that use a combination of methods, and they can come from a variety of sources. They can be academic journals, but they can also be the family and the community to which the patient comes from. Jan could also examine the questions and the contents of her assessment protocols to ensure that they're relevant, necessary, and sensitive to Yura. And if they're not, then Jan can adapt the materials in consultation with the patient or their parents to reflect their diverse perspectives and preferences. Jan's meaningful activities, food, or music may not be reflective of what is meaningful for Yura, and it's Jan's responsibility to ensure that she understands this, but also adapts her material appropriately. So in relation to Yura, following some of the guide's principles, Jan could incorporate non-standardized intervention protocols in Yura's assessment that's based on his specific cultural attributes. And this can include the information that Mary had provided to Jan. Jan can also adopt a more patient-centered approach by including in her report how she considered Yura's Indigenous status when applying those testing protocols, and ultimately how it impacted her recommendations. It's important to document that. And Jan can then highlight how Yura's Indigenous background can provide context for the report and can provide an informed perspective on his speech and language needs. With that, I believe I turn it over to Samita for our final scenario.
Yes, thank you, Priya. So let's have a look at the final scenario, scenario number 4. And this is on engaging in anti-racist and anti-discriminatory practice. So you are attending a team meeting when your professional practice leader makes derogatory comments about a patient and family who belong to the Sikh faith tradition. The comments are inaccurate, and you can sense that they are biasing the discussion in a negative way that will impact the patient's treatment. So we would like to launch another poll. What makes this a difficult situation to act in? Is it the power difference between you and the professional practice leader? Potential for embarrassment or conflict? It might be more awkward if the professional practice leader reacts negatively or if other team members support the PPL's statements. Or you are overwhelmed and don't feel equipped to respond in the moment. So we'll just wait a few more seconds to allow more people to participate. Okay, thank you for your participation. And we can see here that many participants today feel that it's the power difference between the professional practice leader and yourself that would make this a difficult situation to act in. Many are also feeling that the other factors here would be other reasons why you may not feel ready to act in such a situation. The potential for conflict, it will be awkward, and so on. So let's think about this a little further. It helps to ask ourselves some questions to figure out what can we do? How can we take some action in a situation like this? So the first question is, how would you perceive this situation if you were the patient? So if you can imagine that you are the patient that this group of health professionals is sitting around a table and talking about, and if they are making assumptions about you that are untrue or uninformed, it's not going to feel nice for anybody. So I think we can all imagine that that wouldn't be a good experience to have. What would the average person expect a health professional to do in this situation? So if we ask the average person, they would probably say that a health professional should say something, should do something in this situation. If we turn to our code of ethics, we see under the principle of patient benefit that we need to advocate for our patients. And we've pointed out in this webinar as well how the code of ethics talks about the human rights code. We need to take action against racism and discrimination. So what can you say? What can you do? So in the workplace environment, we may witness or be directly affected by racism and discrimination. And racism and discrimination affect how individuals receive care and interact with healthcare providers. And we have seen this through all of our scenarios so far today. Being anti-racist means that we actively recognize race and racism and take action to end racial inequalities in our daily lives. And taking action can happen in many different ways. Not every person feels that they can speak up in every situation, but that is only one way. There are other actions that you can take, other steps that you could take. So let's talk about what you could say or do in a situation like this. So you might refute the validity of the comment. You could say something like, tell me more about why you think that. You could ask for evidence. Do you have some reference material to help me understand your point of view? So this would help to open up more of a conversation to explore where some of these ideas are coming from and what are the facts. You might explain why you're uncomfortable with the comment. You could say something like, I'm concerned we may be drawing conclusions based on assumptions rather than facts. Setting boundaries about your expectations around respectful communications is another way to go about this, and perhaps this would involve talking to your team leader directly. So maybe you have a meeting with the team leader, the professional practice leader, after the group meeting separately to talk about your concerns. Perhaps the first step would be to speak to a trusted colleague for support or help. That might feel like the next logical step, depending on the situation. There are resources. The Human Rights Legal Support Center offers legal services to individuals who have experienced discrimination. So you can direct patients, families, or anybody else to the Human Rights Legal Support Center, the Canadian Centre for Diversity and Inclusion, and the Ontario Human Rights Commission. They provide a lot of educational resources for individuals and also for employers. We would encourage you to also look at your workplace policies in this type of situation. There may be many workplaces that have policies already around how to handle this type of matter, and the CASLPO diversity, equity, and inclusion resources are also available to you. And we've put links here in this slide for you. If we turn to the guide for equitable and inclusive services, there are suggestions in the guide for engaging in anti-racism and anti-discrimination. And some of those suggestions are to learn more about the history of racism, anti-racism, and discrimination. So going back to what we talked about in the land acknowledgement, there are courses that I personally would like to take to learn more in this area. And we talked about in the first question period that there are many different options, educational options available. So seeking out resources as well that challenge your notions. And this is an effective way to do this is through the arts. So watching movies from different parts of the world that represent different communities, visual art, dance, music, attending different events that are happening in your community. Another suggestion is to get involved in anti-racist and anti-discrimination efforts by learning about local groups or even joining a local group. And there is information in the guide on allyship, being an ally. So to get involved in a group and to help uplift their voice and their efforts would be a way for engaging in this type of effort. So that brings us to our next question period.
All right, thank you so much, Samita and Priya. I do have quite a number of questions. If we don't get to your question today, we will respond to them via email. I appreciate all the questions that are coming in. My first question is, what if a client discloses a pronoun preference, but it is not safe to use the preferred pronoun along with the preferred name on reports or in communication or circle of care?
I can jump in on that first. I think one of the things that is important in that scenario is to have a conversation with the patient. It's obviously very important to have a conversation to begin with to understand the pronouns that are used. But if, for instance, the individual is concerned about family members reading a report, then having a direct conversation with the patient to explain not only what's going to be in the report, but who may have access to it, and let them make the decision would be the best course of action. I think I have some feedback. I apologize for that.
That's okay, Priya. Thank you so much. Or do you want to continue with that, Samita? Please.
I'll add a little bit. Yeah, I think there's also the idea of consent that's important to consider, and that there's no age for consent. So if this is an individual who has certain wants or needs around their pronouns being shared or not shared, it would be important to look at, are they able to understand and appreciate the information, and are they giving their consent or not for that information to be shared? So that could be another consideration in this type of scenario.
Thank you. My next question is, we can acknowledge a student's sexuality in sessions and in their reports. In addition, can we also acknowledge a parent's views if they are different from the student, or if they happen to be unaware of the student's current sexuality? Should we acknowledge the student's sexuality, or can we also acknowledge the parent's view? Let me know if you need me to break that down in separate. I can go back and do that for you.
Jessica, you know me very well.
I think I would start, if I would start to comment on that, I would continue with a similar thought to what I was having with the first question. So if a student has a certain, if they have a certain sexuality, and they may or may not want that information to be shared with others. You know, they may not want that information to even be shared with their family. I think a conversation here is really important with the student, you know, and considering their consent. Are they giving consent for that information to be shared or not? If they're not giving the consent, then that needs to be respected. I pass it over to you, Priya, if you have any other comments.
I think that that's great. I think the only thing that I would add is to remember that if a patient, if a child, if a student trusts you as a healthcare professional to disclose that information, and they may not be comfortable disclosing that to their parents or family members, to remember that that trust is very important. And that I think going with that, the consent aspect and having that fully informed conversation would be crucial in that scenario to inform your choices in terms of reports or communications with other parties in the circle of care.
Thank you both. My next question is, and I can't remember if this was covered in the presentation, but what terms should we use instead of preferred pronoun?
I would jump in and say just pronoun. What pronoun is used? It's not what's your preferred name or what's your preferred skin tone or what's your preferred ethnicity. It's just a fact. And so if you're asking what the fact is, it doesn't need to be prefaced with preferred. It's a lot of P words.
Yes. Thank you, Priya. My next question is, will you be collecting more data on future renewal dates?
Yes, the intention is that we will continue to collect data at the annual renewals. Ideally, we'd like to be able to collect a breadth of data to be able to demonstrate whether there are any trends that have changed in the demographic of the registrant base over the next couple of years. And so that data would be particularly crucial for us to be able to track any changes amongst our registrant base.
Thank you, Priya. I have another question. It is, what if you're in a supervision group with colleagues who refuse to use the patient's chosen pronoun when discussing your patient?
I would say that's a bad practice. Ultimately, that's wildly disrespectful, I would say. It is a form of discrimination, as we mentioned earlier in the presentation. And it certainly rises to, I would say, the risk or an increased likelihood that a complaint or subsequent investigation may be launched against those healthcare professionals. Because as we indicated, healthcare professionals are held to higher standards to be required to provide inclusive and equitable care. Now, Smita, do you have anything else to add?
I would just add that I know that with practice advice, people ask, what should I do if another person is acting in this particular way? And I think that you can control what you do. You can't control what other people do. But I think if we reflect on the principles we've been talking about in this guide, when we're working with colleagues, we can direct them to these resources, direct them to the standards, direct them to this guide, keep the conversation going, because ultimately that is part of protecting the patient's best interest. And you can't control how other colleagues are going to behave. It's just not possible. But you can make the effort to keep this conversation happening and to keep being a part of, engaging in this dialogue that's important. We talked about also everybody's journey in this understanding is different. But I do agree with Priya that if people are not embracing, these ideas and listening to their patients and families, it might end up being something that would have to be dealt with in another way.
Thank you. I think we have time for one last quick question, since it's 2 minutes until the presentation ends. And that is, do I have to identify my pronouns in my professional communications if I do not want to?
I'd say the answer is no. If you don't feel comfortable or don't feel it's required or necessary, you don't have to. Amongst CASLPO staff, for example, it's an option whether staff would like to include it in their pronouns. But it's important to note that this is a conversation that people need to feel comfortable having. If you don't feel comfortable, if you don't feel that it's appropriate for your circumstances, and so your pronouns are either not relevant or not needed, then you wouldn't be required to.
I agree.
Perfect. Thank you, Priya. Again, if your question was not answered in the presentation, we will be responding to questions via email. Thank you so much for everyone that submitted a question. We really appreciate it.
And to echo Jessica's Thanks. I think we're going to close out very quickly. Thank you very much, everyone, for attending today's presentation and participating. As we indicated earlier, the presentation has been recorded. It will be posted on our website with the slides from today's deck. And we hope that you all have a wonderful afternoon. Thank you very much.
Thank you.